Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And I am here to say welcome to the first day or our first interview of the 2021 Planetary Health Annual Meeting, co-hosted by the University of São Paulo and the Planetary Health Alliance. I am Raquel Santiago, professor at the Federal University of Goiás in the Middle West of Brazil, and I would like to briefly introduce Herton Escobar, a Brazilian science and environmental journalist currently working as a special report at the University of São Paulo Communications Office. For the previous 20 years, he was a reporter of O Estado de São Paulo newspaper. In recent years, his coverage has been strongly focused on science policy and research under and funding in Brazil. Since January 2015, he is also contributing writer to Science magazine and a freelancer at large. Welcome, Herton. From now on, the word is with you. And thank you for your participating here.
Hello, Raquel. Thank you very much for the introduction. And good afternoon or good evening, good morning to everyone, wherever and whenever you're watching this. Thank you very much to the organizer for inviting me and allowing me to be a part of this conference. Very happy to be here and speaking from my home in São Paulo, Brazil. And very happy as well to introduce our two guests for this interview, or I'll prefer to call it a conversation today, Dr. Julia Kim and Professor John Halliwell. Dr. Julia Kim is a leading expert in global health and well-being and the program director of the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan. She previously worked as a physician and HIV researcher in Africa and Asia before serving with the United Nations Development Program and UNICEF in New York. Today, speaking with us from Vancouver, Canada. Hello, Julia. Thank you very much for being here. And we'll also have Professor John Halliwell. He's a professor emeritus in the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia, distinguished fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, officer of the Order of Canada, and one of the editors of the World Happiness Report, which many of you may know, comes out every year in March. And that's our topic for today. Hello, John, thank you very much for being here. And our topic for today is happiness. You know, what does it mean to be happy in the 21st century? And I think it's a wonderful choice by the organizers, a wonderful choice of topic, because that's, in the end, that's all what we're all striving for, right? We all have different lifestyles, different goals in life. We may interpret happiness in many different ways, but that's in the end, that's all what we're all trying to get to. You know, we're trying to live a happy life. And the topic of the conference is planetary health. So I want to kick off our conversation here, Julia and John. I'll try to be as informal as possible, right? That's kind of my way of conducting things. How does individual or societal happiness connects with this larger topic of planetary health? You know, a lot of people may not realize all the connections there exist there. So, and if I may start with a quote from Gina McCarthy. She's the National Climate Advisor for the White House. I was watching the Climate Summit, Leaders Summit last week, and she said something which I thought was very strong. She said, you know, there are no jobs on a dead planet. You know, she was making the case that fighting climate change was an opportunity to create jobs and make an industrial revolution. And, you know, if we're living on a dead planet, there won't be any jobs. And we can just substitute happiness, substitute jobs for happiness. You know, how are we going to be happy on a dead planet? Maybe that's a way to connect things. So I'll pass to Julia. Julia, I'll let you go first. Please, your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Herton. It's such a pleasure to be here, and very inspired by the opening of this conference as well. I think it's an excellent question. For many people, it might be, why are we talking about happiness in the context of these big global crises we are facing? It seems like a frivolous issue. We'll park happiness to the side and we'll fix the planet first. But to me, through the work I've been doing in development and more recently at the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan, I think they're fundamentally connected. So a sense of, as I think it was Karena Gore was saying the last session, we shouldn't just be aiming for sustainability, just barely surviving on this planet. We should be aiming for flourishing. And at times of crisis, we need to ask ourselves, why are we here? What is the purpose of a human life? And I think when you start talking about happiness and well-being, it raises the bar to talk about meaning and values and purpose, which was so core to this morning's session. I think that, like the analogy that you said, jobs are not the end of the story here. One way of looking at it on a personal level is when you're on your deathbed and you're looking back on your life, most people would not say, I wish I had worked more. They are looking at, have they been happy? What are the relationships, the meaning and purpose in their life? And when you do that, you start talking about how am I connected to my own sense of well-being, the happiness of others, and the environment. And naturally, that connection to planetary well-being starts to come from that. If we start from an impoverished mentality, a chasing after economic growth, the I never have enough mentality, that's what's driving the destruction of our planet. So I loved the beginning of this conference, which really talked about what is the inner state, the values and vision that we're coming from, because that creates the system that we are then bringing into reality, whether it's the economic system or the social system. So happiness, well-being, human flourishing is intimately connected with how we are on this planet. So I'll just start with that. I'd love to hear what John has to say as well.
Jan, please, the word is with you.
I'd like to provide some optimistic views about how the science of well-being can contribute to planetary health. Everyone agrees that you want a planet that has its own well-being and health, with individuals on Earth who do as well. What were a lot of attempts to get to planetary health have assumed that people operate selfishly in their own interests. And so to get them to look after the environment, you tax them or regulate them. And a lot of those efforts aren't getting very far. What the science of well-being tells us, looking back over many centuries, is that people really get their deep happiness from being together with each other and for doing things with and for each other. And so a happier planet requires, of course, because it's a planet, so everyone has to, in some sense, work together. And they have to think not just about themselves and today, but about the future. And it turns out that although it's a slow process, humans over many millennia have developed this broader capacity to work together to common purpose. It's often forgotten and underestimated, because what you tend to hear is about the bad things of life, and you don't realize, in fact, how generous and public-spirited people are. And to produce planetary health requires people to think in the very broadest terms. And so we're discovering that in order to get pro-environmental behavior working, and communities and countries, and of course in the world, really requires giving people the option to develop and work by social norms to produce a better world. And those social norms are enormously important. We find this, of course, in every crisis, from climatic crises to earthquakes and tsunamis and COVID-19, that a crisis puts a society under pressure, but it also allows the best to come out in people. And they discover, in fact, that it is much more natural for them to work together than to work separately and against each other. And that's one of the reasons why crises often bring people together and provide positive support. And I think if you take that view, you think that the design and the encouragement of social norms to give people really something to do to produce a more sustainable planet will not only be sustainable itself, because it'll make people happier to be working in this broader purpose, but of course it'll be the happiest way to produce a happy planet.
Thank you for that, John. Let me throw you another question. You were talking about well-being research, and happiness or well-being is something that people may not realize, may not see as something that you can do science on, right? But it is. So maybe if you both could explain a little bit, how can science be approached from a scientific perspective, you know, as a topic of research, and from that, how can, if we can research and produce data about happiness, how do you use that, put a value on it, and use that as part of public policy for economic or social development? John, let's start with you, since you got your mic open already.
There are two ways of measuring happiness. One is happiness as an emotion. How happy are you right now? It turns out that's very important, but it's not the broader measure that we use to think about life as a whole. For that, we use what's called some measure of a life evaluation. What do you think about the quality of your life as a whole? Turns out people are very good at answering that question. They understand it and they answer it easily. And we collect these data from thousands of people around in 150 countries around the world, and then use various aspects of their life to explain these differences in life evaluation. Within countries, we can get much bigger samples of data, and so we can dig deeper into people's lives. And hence, we start getting these conclusions like the ones I started out by saying, that in fact, social and pro-social behavior is a primary determinant of people's happiness. And so I'm not just telling stories, I'm giving you the results of much broader analysis of data that often surprises people who are used to hearing that people are selfish and narrow. Well, in fact, the data say that people, let me give you one particular piece of data out of recent research. That we now have from a very large survey a couple of years ago. People asked, how likely is it that you'll be a subject to violent crime, mental health problems? This is just before COVID. And how likely is it that your wallet would be returned if it was found by a stranger or a police officer, all on the same scale? It turns out to live in a society where you think your wallet would be returned if found by a stranger. So that's a benevolent, high trust, pro-social society. That's worth much more to your overall life evaluation than the negative effects of all of those other risks that I talked about. So it shows you how important it is for people to live in that kind of society where they're working together.
Perfect. And Julia, Bhutan has been a pioneer in kind of incorporating, you know, happiness as part of the constitution and public policy. What's your approach on this? How can we use happiness to measure success and development?
Thank you, Herton. I think building on what John said, you know, starting with what we are defining as happiness, not just these fleeting feelings of being happy or in a good mood. But in Bhutan, there's a really beautiful definition from the first Prime Minister of Bhutan. And he said that true abiding happiness, lasting happiness, cannot exist while others suffer and comes only from serving others, living in harmony with nature and coming to know our innate wisdom. So it's a very profound definition of happiness that speaks to the relational aspect. It's not my happiness for me, it's how am I living in relationship to myself, to my own sense of purpose and wisdom, to others, and to nature. So from that point of view, you start saying, how do we influence the country, in this case, Bhutan, so the government can create an enabling environment for happiness? And this is where some of that science comes in. So in Bhutan, they have a national survey, the Gross National Happiness Survey, that's undertaken, you know, every 3 years or so, where they measure 9 domains that are seen as creating an enabling environment for happiness. And they include some of the basic things that are in many surveys: health, education, living standards, obviously are important for well-being and happiness. But some of the other ones that John mentioned, community vitality, how well do you know your neighbors? Do you feel supported if something happens to you? Are you donating? Is there a sense of generosity? Time use is measured, really important. We notice for many of us in our busy developed countries, our happiness is very much tied to our time use or lack thereof. Other things like cultural diversity and resilience, our connection to the environment, are we preserving the environment, good governance, do we trust our governments, are we voting? All of these can be measured and give you a sense of whether the country is creating an environment where people can flourish. And based on that, you can make policies that promote that or not. So the surveys and the science are important, but they also have to be put into action through policy making. There's a whole inner dimension to gross national happiness that I think is also interesting because the science is coming up for that as well. The state of our minds, our ability to be aware and in the present moment. A really excellent paper called "A Distracted Mind is an Unhappy Mind," published in Science, which is showing how much we are distracted often by social media, smartphones, and that when we are not present, which is about 50% of our time, we're less happy. And it has more to do with whether we're actually with the fact that we're doing the dishes than it has to do with whether we're doing an activity that we would think is really pleasurable. The neuroscience also showing that we can cultivate the ability to be happy and resilient. So neuroplasticity and the impact on training and compassion, meditation and awareness is bringing new insight into the fact that it's not just up to our outer environment, not just up to our genes, but that we have the ability to cultivate the ability to be happy and well. Healthy Minds is one group under the leadership of Dr. Richard Davidson that's been doing a lot of this research. And they've distilled it down to 4 elements, which can be practiced and cultivated both from the wisdom traditions and from neuroscience. And they include awareness, the ability to be present, connection, our ability to really be compassionate, altruistic, pro-social behaviors, as John mentioned, insight. So some insight into how our mind works. What are the stories and narratives we tell each other, tell ourselves, positive or negative, and also purpose. Do we have a sense of meaning and purpose even when things are difficult? So I think that balance of the science of the outer social change, the systems change, the policy is growing stronger, and the science on the inner aspects of cultivating well-being. So it's an exciting time.
Good. And just to remind our audience that we are open for questions in the chat of the transmission. So if you have a question, feel free to type it up, and then our support team here will try to forward some of these questions to us. But before I pass to some questions for the public, John, you're a professor of economics, right? How does the experience in Bhutan that Julia just described, how could that be transferred or adapted and incorporated by much larger countries with larger economies and bigger populations? What can we learn from Bhutan? How can we apply that to other countries and economic systems?
Bhutan essentially sparked a revolution in happiness studies and happiness policy around the world. In the last decade or so, it has been through the UN resolution brought by the Prime Minister Finlay of Japan to the UN, led to the First World Happiness Report, and essentially a use of measures of how well people think of their lives as a way of refocusing attention from the material and the immediate to the longer term and the more social. That has then led in turn to emphasis on how Bhutan has made this work. So I'd like to, first of all, make a shout out to Bhutan in these COVID times, that you ask, how does a happy, well-connected, pro-social society like Bhutan handle COVID? And the answer is brilliantly, because they were very quick off the mark to understand the science of what was required in order to stop it, to test, to isolate, and to look after each other during isolation, during illness, and so on. So in the first year, 2020, there was not a single death in Bhutan. and their handling of it has been absolutely superb. And it comes from the ability to care for each other, to look after each other, and to think about the broad environment in which people live. That's Bhutan. Now, if you look at the World Happiness Report, the happiest countries, in fact, are the Nordic countries. And so we have also then looked at them in COVID times too, and find out they haven't been at the same level of handling the pandemic as Bhutan, but they've been pretty good, much better than the other, with the exception of Sweden, much better than the other European countries. And once again, attention way before COVID had been lodged on these Nordic countries because they had regularly ranked at the top of these international rankings of life evaluation. They were surprised themselves they were so ranked, and other people were surprised too. It has led to a huge flowering of books about life in the Nordic countries, the Danes, the Finns, the Norwegians, of what's going on there that allows them to be happy. Well, it's not an accident that when the first wallet dropping experiments were done around the world, in Helsinki, 10 wallets were dropped and all 10 were returned. And routinely, these measures of people, how they connect with each other and how they look after each other, are absolutely the highest in the Nordic countries. And people are now understanding around the world that that's what makes people happier. So these pebbles thrown out by Bhutan to the rest of the world are plopping down in ponds everywhere. And people are looking around them and saying, what is life all about? And with the science, in order to support their intuitions, they're changing their lives. And so they are reaching out more to other people than they did before, and not on selfish grounds. It's not just, here's how to make yourself happier. It's here's how you can help to do something for the world. You see, that's when it links back to planetary health, because once you want to think about something that clearly is not of immediate benefit to your own personal lifestyle, but you're committed to, you're working to make a better world, it turns out there's a bonus for happiness for you, but that's not the point. The real point is to work together and produce a happier planet.
Very nice, John. Thank you. Nice, beautiful metaphor with the pebbles and the ponds. Let me throw in some questions from the public now. I think you can see them in the chat as well. I'm gonna read 3 of them, and I think they have a lot of connections. And then Julia first, and then John, you can kind of give your thoughts on them. So the first question is how to change the narrative of what makes us happy. Now, how can the positive outcomes from COVID that you spoke of promote behavioral change toward planetary health values? We already kind of touched on that, but maybe go a little deeper into it. And the other 2 questions, how can we promote the Bhutanese concept of happiness in our mostly selfish, greedy Western society? Which is kind of a little bit the question that I asked, but in more direct terms. And the last one, how would you tackle the cultural differences into what happiness means? Each place might have specific measures and opinions on that. So, Julia, please.
Thank you, Herton. Those are great questions, and I'll try to wrap them into each other because they are kind of related. You know, I think the important thing around the measures, Bhutan's never promoted that everybody should be measuring the same thing. And in fact, they themselves have said, we're open to, you know, changing how we're measuring the 9 domains if that seems important. But what is distinct, and I think is the main point, is that it's in distinction, in contrast to what has been the main guidepost for development in many of the world's countries, which is GDP growth. So gross national happiness as a phrase was coined when the 4th king of Bhutan was asked, what is the gross national product of Bhutan? And he said, in Bhutan, gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. So it's rather than chasing GDP growth that you bring in other measures. And those can be different in different countries. And they need to incorporate, at the very least, our relationship with nature and our relationship with others, community and nature. And I mentioned the other ones that Bhutan has. Then they need to be enfolded into how we make decisions and policy and so forth. So I think there's some really exciting work coming out of Wellbeing Economies Alliance. A shout out to this organization that is bringing together these movements towards new measures and well-being economies all around the world. So there are lots of examples, and they don't all have to be at the national level either. Sometimes cities can make huge progress on that. Amsterdam and I believe San Francisco are looking at incorporating Kate Raworth's donut economics model into the cities. Mayors are often very accountable to the well-being and happiness of their city. So how can policymaking be influenced by these new metrics and ways of thinking at smaller levels, even companies and organizations, because business plays such a big role in what we measure, what we consider as progress. Some of them are bringing in new measures that are looking at well-being and happiness, not just for the organization, but how are they contributing to planetary well-being, planetary health. So I think to think creatively outside of the box is really important. And I want to counter this belief because I think it's a really, it's not true, and it can be disheartening that we in the West are these selfish kind of greedy people that will not be able to turn our behavior. Because, you know, if you heard our first speakers, this way of thinking has not happened in a vacuum. When we talk about decolonizing our minds, decolonizing our thinking, it means often some of us who are in the colonial countries have been colonized by a way of thinking of the world as being purely material, of a separating of the inner life and the objective life. And that has resulted in a kind of economic system that commodifies everything. When you commodify everything and you chase GDP growth, you end up with a vision of a human being that has been called Homo economicus, economical man, which is that kind of perverse reduction of human beings to little shoppers who are only looking after their own self-interest. We know from COVID, the way people have responded to each other's needs, the way they've been seeing with compassion what's happening around them, that this is not our true nature. And so it's how do we bring in a new narrative and first acknowledge to ourselves that we have been kind of brainwashed by this way of thinking and look at ways of undoing that. And there were some beautiful explanations from our earlier speakers about that. So I really challenge that assumption that we in the West can only be this way. We have been shaped by a particular economic system, by chasing GDP growth, by kind of capitalist, materialist mindset that we now can start to undo because we're seeing its negative impacts, not just for the poor, but for the wealthy. Really great research, The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, showing that chasing GDP growth leads to widening inequalities, and widening inequalities leads to more unhappiness and well-being, not just for the poor, but for the wealthy. So it's in all of our interests to actually be moving our measurements and moving towards greater well-being, and it's happening.
John?
Let me pick up positively where Julia has started moving us. It is very important to start changing everything. You see, I think it doesn't take a great shift to get people out of a material mindset into another one, because a lot of their actual behavior shows at their human level, they are not in that mindset. And so it's then a question of changing the ways in which things are done and to liberate people from old shackles. Economics was not always about GDP. 2 centuries ago, the objective was realized to produce better lives for people. The 18th century economists said happiness is what the goal should be. Because it was not measured and was not thought to be measurable, gradually economics tended to be concerned with material things. Well, everyone realized in principle that was wrong, but there wasn't an easy substitute. It still isn't easy, but there's now a substitute. So we can rethink things, but it requires rethinking the whole world from a negative way to a positive way. In other words, we shouldn't be thinking in health about waiting until people are sick and then making them make repairs. We should be thinking of a health system that produces happy lives. That's the way it does it. Well, it changes the way you think about mental health. It changes the way you think about physical health, because people feel better about their lives when they themselves have freedom to act and involve themselves. Then you have a healthcare system that involves patients and doctors and the citizens as a whole working together to produce more physical health. Education should not be about teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. There's a whole positive education movement that's essentially teaching people by example to work together. There's a lovely operation in the middle of Canada, in Saskatchewan, that's doing just that. So we're sending researchers into this to show that this is the way to make education work to produce a happier world and a happier planet. What do? They take a grade 6 class and they bring it into an elder care facility, and the whole year is spent with that class, learning with each other and sharing education, sharing happiness, sharing connections, sharing games with these people in high-level elder care. And the interviews we've had with these children and the parents and the people in the elder care, they bring tears to your eyes, but they're not tears of sadness, they're tears of happiness. And that can be done in education. It can clearly be done in the workplace. You ask people what's most important in their workplace. It turns out a feeling of working together with other people is much more important than salary. It's much more important than anything else. So once you recognize that it's these social connections that empower us and lead us to do bigger things together, then the mechanics fall by the wayside. But you have to, first of all, get that light burning.
Very nice. Okay, we're heading into the final 10 minutes. Let me throw in a couple more questions from the public, and I'll add one more from myself here. The first question is, with your work on happiness, can you give your opinion on ecological grief and how to handle it? I imagine that's in reference to the desperation maybe of seeing how the way our planet is going right now, and dealing with that feeling. And the second question, we are increasingly using pharmaceutical solutions to address unhappiness. How do we address this unsatisfactory solution that's also bad for the environment, by the way? And can social connectedness toward planetary health and ecological well-being help us harness and direct happiness? And let me throw in another ingredient, since this probably be our last round of questions. I think we should talk a little bit about technology too. You both mentioned it somewhat, but here we are talking from thousands of kilometers away, connected in real time by technology. And once COVID is gone, I think this might be the new normal for conferences and international meetings, and we are increasingly doing our social relationships in the digital world. How do you think that's going to affect happiness overall, and maybe change the way we see this? So, Julia, your final comments, and then John, please.
Well, I think, Herton, the question about technology, maybe I'll tackle first. There's been a lot of commentary on the technological revolution that we're in. And as always, like from the first time man discovered fire, it's not about the tool, it's about how we use it. And fire can be incredibly life nourishing, allow us to cook food, we gather to tell stories around the fire, or it can burn down a village. So it's, are we using it wisely, and are we the masters of the technology? And certainly the Zoom has been helpful for us in coming together like this, but I would love to sit down and have a cup of tea with John and you after our talk, which we won't be able to do, and to mingle with our audience. But it does give us a sense of, for me, I've been able to lower my carbon footprint, and I will certainly be more discerning in my travel when it does start up again. And I think we can combine virtual and face-to-face in a way that we haven't before, and really appreciate the face-to-face when it happens, realize how precious that is. And I think in regards to the pharmaceutical question, and yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about many of our developed countries is at the cost of chasing economic growth, we've seen more and more anxiety and depression and loneliness that has been coming up. And as John said, It's about how do we prevent that rather than treat it after the fact, which is what the pharmaceutical industry is. So if you look at creating a well-being economy and looking at, for example, the 9 domains that Bhutan is measuring, that's looking at it from a social determinants of health perspective. How do we bring together those factors that allow for mental, physical, social well-being? Then we aren't chasing after it with the drugs, as we know, which aren't as good as preventing and which are very expensive and not good for the environment, as our participants said. And maybe lastly, this question of ecological grief. It's a big one. And I think this is where I come back to the fact that cultivating resilience and looking at different tools is really important. For me, when I was working at the UN, it was very challenging for me, even though I had a big budget, a global team, working on things like climate change, at that time, the Millennium Development Goals. At the end of the day, I really didn't know if I was making a difference. I had no idea. When I was a doctor, I would know at the end of the day, oh, better or not, better or worse, I knew that something had happened with my patient. But with this kind of work, for those who are working on these issues, you can burn out. And for me, that was when cultivating a meditation practice really helped me to let go of the need to see the outcomes on my watch, to act now as if I would see the outcomes tomorrow with that kind of energy and enthusiasm, but knowing it may be the next generation. And that kind of resilience, that ability to have a broader time horizon gets cultivated when you come to know your own mind and when you start to see when your ego is the one that's wanting to see those results. It's important for politicians to have, because we know they're working on 4-year time cycles, which is not how we're going to beat this. And it's important for us as individuals to really get a sense of time and separate it from the objective linear sense of time, which we know is not actually the reality of time from both a physics and a metaphysical point of view.
Very nice. John?
Susan Andrews in Brazil had some nice experiments on trying to build social capital and environmental awareness. And she found one of the most effective things when people got together was to get people from very different backgrounds together. And this speaks to the question about going to the corner store. They ended up bringing together people who had never met one another before. And how did they get these deep social connections and greater trust among them? They decided to collectively clean up the local river. And so they all got down in their local watershed and cleaning it up and making a better environment for each other. Now, they were happier in many respects. They had broken down some of the class and income and racial divides that had previously separated them through their lifestyles. And you got a happier community out of that. Similarly, in picking up the point about mental health care, there are 3 different ways of thinking about mental health. One is medications, another is cognitive behavioral therapy, and the third one is to change the way people live their lives and to focus them in a happier way. And the cognitive behavioral therapy is a road into that because it helps people to think about their lives and what's wrong with them. But you have to then open it up and not, as it were, have a minister of loneliness and deal with it when it becomes a problem. But you want a minister of friends. We all ought to be ministers of friendship. And that's really what's required. The stress is less, anxiety is less, loneliness is less, everything is less when it's shared. And fear is less when you know the people around you. And so that building these human connections, nowadays we have to do it electronically, but that'll make us not only cherish these electronic connections and new friendships we've acquired this way, but it will allow us to make those same principles flower on a personal level when we get a chance again. So I'm optimistic that in fact, COVID has helped turn the social media from, in fact, social negatives to making them real social media, that they're in fact going to be much more able to be used to build community rather than to share blame.
agree with you on that. John, so unfortunately our time's up, and I will still to be very strict on timekeeping. So I'm going to have to end our conversation here. Julia and John, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very, very much for your thoughts. I hope we brought some enlightening ideas and facts here for people to process. And just let everybody know, in 20 minutes, if you're watching live the conference, there will be lightning talks on mental health and planetary health. Mental health, we were just talking about that. So there's the invitation there to stay on and watch those lightning talks as in the next session. So again, thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers. Thank you for everyone who watched. Stay healthy, and let's make this world a better one as soon as possible. Thank you, everyone, and see you later.
Thank you all.